Hello and welcome to the Nerd Squadron Podcast 535. My name is Chris, and today we're actually going to go back to a former topic we had in a previous episode, namely Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Um, in that previous episode, I had my first impressions with the game, talked about it with Andrew. But for now, I am here to give you a more in depth review after playing it for a longer period of time. So, one big thing that I've seen from playing this game that reminded me of the previous Legend of Zelda games entirely was that this same vibe I got from seeing this new Hyrule and seeing all the monsters and the different tone that was set for it is very similar to how the two worlds were in Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. And when you play those games previously, if you haven't, the game has a sudden shift in difficulty as well as uh, mood for the game. For example, Ocarina of Time, when you go forward in time, the mood gets much darker. You realize much more is at stake. The dungeons and monsters are much more dangerous. And the same thing for Link to the Past as well. In Tears of the Kingdom, there was a lot more enemies than there were before. And so instead of fighting like five or six bokoblins, which are like the grunts in the game, they're facing like 12 or 13 at a time. And that causes you to, it incentivizes the use of the new tools, which are like the Zonai equipment, like wheels and fans and wings and the like, add new powers with fuse and the like to create new weapons and stuff to fight the monsters. And without it, you're gonna just have a much more difficult time. Like I did, I died so many times to like some stupid stuff, like a goblin shooting an arrow at me when I'm fighting monsters. So like you have to be much more aware than you were before. But it actually makes the game much more fun and reasonably difficult compared to say just increasing their health. One thing that I've also faced was with this area called the Deaths. You're able to see this actually early in the game after the intro, but you probably will want to visit the overworld a bit more before you go down there. But throughout the world, it's littered with giant gaping holes of this thing called gloom, and when you fall in, they have an underground world that's, I believe, the size of the entire overworld, which is actually pretty damn amazing. But it's all completely dark. Like you actually need these things called like bright bloom seeds or fire, like to lighten your way. Otherwise, you can just be going in blind. It gives it a whole new like level of danger and like curiosity. Like you want to discover what's down there more, and I think that was really cool when they added it for as well. When I went down there, I believe I found this giant ring, and I just saw this one. What do you call it? A red light, kind of like a security thing, and I thought it was just like one of those monsters that just give an alarm. I went to it. It was pitch black, and then it was actually a boss, and I had to fight it. It had no arrow, so it actually made it super difficult, and I was kind of freaking out. Um, so one thing I've also noticed is that the villages in the game are a lot more in depth with their characters. To make them a lot more, I guess, alive is a proper word for it. The characters all have their more own in depth like stories and lives that they talk to you about, as well as like you get to be involved in them. Like they have more quests in the villages, and I think outside of it, Hateno Village is definitely one of those big examples. The world is a lot more people going around instead of in Breath of the Wild. I believe it's because obviously like Breath of the Wild is post like I guess apocalypse when like the Calamity Ganon took over and like destroyed the world basically, and Tears of the Kingdom was just them recovering from it. So it's a lot more lively than it was then. One also huge example was like you see them talking about these other things that are happening, like certain characters that might be of a major importance, or like and these ruins and stuff that they also see that they might give hints for. And I really like that they added that, just so it feels like the world is not just like uh, just a sandbox, and it feels like an actual world that you feel unique in having these powers, and it doesn't just feel like a game. I really appreciate that from Nintendo. One also huge thing that I've also noticed is that the dungeons are a lot more different than they were before. So like when you actually play Tears of the Kingdom in comparison to Breath of the Wild, the movement towards the dungeons, like when you try to progress to it, is a lot more like a dungeon of itself than it was in Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild, for the most part, they're just I think escorts, or maybe you're like riding on some beast or like boat to try to get to the divine beast, which were the dungeons then. And even then, in those dungeons, there wasn't as many enemies. I don't think there was much of any. In Tears of the Kingdom, though, the whole uh, area that leads up to these dungeons are all full of puzzles already. They all have monsters fighting you while you go through it. So that's a big bonus in comparison to the previous game. And when you get to these dungeons, they have the enemies there are very much difficult, and you still have to be innovative in how you handle like the puzzles there as well. The bosses are also very much like unique and like spectacular. I remember going to the Hebra dungeon, which was this giant, spoilers by the way, is a giant ship in the sky basically, and you see these boats around it. You have to go on top of these boats and trampoline to each platform to get there. And the boss there is this giant worm. It reminded me of that Majora's Mask creature. I forgot what it is. Twin Mold, I think it is. And it was a giant worm beast, and it had like these icicle like carapace they have to shoot down and stuff in midair. And it was a lot more interesting than just like four iterations of Calamity Ganon, like in different forms. So I really like that they went with a new approach to bring out these new creatures. Especially like one of my favorite characters, my favorite enemies in Legend of Zelda altogether, Redeads. I think they were Gibdos though. I faced them, and the new iteration actually still looks pretty cool. I don't like how they don't scream anymore, but you know you can't win everything. So I do like the mechanics with the fuse tool. I remember like actually using them to find innovative ways to kill like waves of minions, like without having to worry about like trying to take them on one by one, or like trying to like whittle down to health. Like I had innovative ways to do it, especially with the reverse time tool. It was really interesting to actually use these tools, especially in the puzzles. The shrines are a lot more like, there are a lot more brain twisters than there are like previously. It doesn't hold your hand in the slightest. But I recommend that you definitely play Tears of the Kingdom. It definitely feels like a completely new game altogether, and I think it was worth its money. I think like I can go back and play this game over and over again. I was really worried about the $70 price increase. I figured you can't really argue against it too much because inflation and everything. But I wish it was still $60, but it wasn't like I lost from paying this full price, so I thought it was worth it. Anything else though? The only thing I have an issue with the game is that the amount of ways you can use the tools, like the Zonai equipment and stuff like that, like the stuff you find, devices, is very limited to the small areas where you can find them. And I really wish that you can like keep your tools and everything. I know there's a way you can save like builds and stuff like that, but when you want to get more parts, I wish there was like more access to that. But there's only a few places you could. But that's really just a basic complaint. Everything else was perfectly fine with the game, and I completely recommend it to anyone who wants to try to play it. But that being said, I know this is a short podcast episode. I do appreciate you listening to this episode. We're going to have a lot more episodes coming up soon with brand new topics regarding especially DC. I think a few movie reviews. But stay tuned and be sure to like, comment, subscribe. My name is Chris, and thank you for listening to the Nerd Squadron podcast.